regime, several were poised to leave. Ed Robinson, Nabisco's chief financial officer, was on the verge of taking a high-level post at A&P, the grocery chain. Peter Rogers had made up his mind to resign as well, and Andy Barrett, Nabisco's personnel chief, was headed for a job in his native England. Bob Carbonell was complaining about how you had to raise your hand to go to the bathroom. Martin Emmett had left before the merger, although he remained on the payroll as chairman of Nabisco Canada. Johnson traveled to New York and urged his friends to be patient. Things would change, he assured them. But he knew it wouldn't be easy to hold them much longer. They hardly bothered to hide their alienation and sense of a separate identity. At the Dinah Shore golf tournament following the merger, a retired Del Monte executive was introduced to Ed Robinson and tried to make pleasant conversation. "Are you from the RJR side of the company or the Nabisco?" the man asked. "Neither," Robinson replied. "Standard Brands." As the Merry Men's sense of despondency grew, Johnson directed his PR man, Mike Masterpool, to stage a banquet to commemorate the 10th anniversary of Henry Weigel's overthrow. Held in May 1986 at the Brook Club in New York, it brought together a dozen of Johnson's co-conspirators as well as their board supporters from that fateful day in 1976. The Merry Men took turns reading the board minutes to great cheers, rose to tell Weigel's stories to great laughter, and, of course, drank mightily. Johnson capped the evening by handing everyone a paperweight inscribed with the numerals 10-5-1. The meaning, 10 years since the Standard Brands overthrow, 5 years since the Nabisco merger, 1 year since the Reynolds merger. The upshot? This subjugation, too, would pass. Johnson, meanwhile, was doing his best to ingratiate himself with Tylee Wilson. It wasn't easy. The two men were complete opposites, and Wilson, unlike Bob Shaberly, was no pushover. Wilson asked each senior executive to submit his daily schedule for the next 3 months. Wilson himself was personally scheduled to the minute for the next quarter. Johnson's schedule, if it could be called that, was subject to change by the minute. On the spur of the moment, he might leave Winston-Salem in late afternoon and fly to New York for dinner. Wilson preferred to unwind with solitary weekends on his boat. Johnson liked rounding up an entourage of his celebrity friends for an all-weekend party, inviting a grocery executive or two along so he could write the whole shindig off. Wilson cringed at Johnson's expense account. When he got a tab for a $13,000 weekend at a Colorado country club, he asked Johnson whether all the hoopla was really necessary. Johnson could always spin a superb rationale about how piddling the cost was compared to the goodwill his party had engendered with grocery executives. "A few $1 million," he quipped, "are lost in the sands of time." For his part, Wilson worried that Johnson had the style of one of those television pitchmen shouting, "We will not be undersold." He was forever coming up with new ideas, independent of Wilson's beloved channels. Some were intriguing, although Johnson would likely have moved on to a whole different notion by the next day. At least one of Johnson's ideas Wilson found disquieting. Soon after the merger had been completed, a spate of new lawsuits were filed against tobacco companies, charging they had caused smokers' deaths. Reynolds's stock, which had been marching steadily upward, fell more than 10 points into the mid-20s. Johnson came bursting into Wilson's office. "You know, Ty, we really ought to be thinking about doing an LBO." Wilson eyed Johnson coldly. He knew all about leveraged buyouts and didn't like them a bit. "Ross," he said, "I don't think much of that idea." Wilson gave Johnson a lecture on how the industry would win those suits, how the tobacco stocks would recover. "I know this is a frustrating time," he said, "but it's only a temporary setback." For all their differences in style, Wilson and Johnson rarely disagreed on business matters, and Wilson came to appreciate Johnson's quick mind. Johnson was especially useful to his boss in handling the planned consolidation of Nabisco and Del Monte. Johnson also made points by firing Sammy Gordon, the banana trader close to Paul Stick. After most major mergers, some businesses must be sold. Johnson and Wilson easily agreed which ones. Canada Dry was one, Del Monte Frozen Foods another. Johnson did his usual masterful job of selling them. Wilson, in fact, was so pleased with Johnson that he encouraged him to get to know the board members. Stick, who initially tagged Johnson as a slippery character, shared a transatlantic plane flight with him and later told a luncheon companion, "You know, he's not a bad sort." Other directors were even more taken. Much as it had with Henry Weigel a decade before, Johnson's easy charm contrasted sharply with the prickliness of his boss. Wilson plowed through a 5-point discourse on why Canada Dry didn't fit into the strategic plan and therefore must be divested. Johnson simply told directors, "You could walk on water with that business, and holy hell, there's the boys from Coke and Pepsi waiting for you on the other side." Behind his back, Johnson made fun of Wilson, whom he called jiggerballs. Nobody knew what that meant exactly, but it clearly didn't fall into the category of affectionate nicknames. On trips to New York, Johnson spun great tales of Wilson and the faltering tobacco business for his despondent chums. "Why, if you listened to our guys, you'd think we were kicking the shit out of Philip Morris," Johnson told them. "It reminds me of the boxer who's getting beat up something awful and going back to his corner at the end of the round saying, 'He never laid a glove on me.' The trainer says, 'Well, keep an eye on the referee because somebody's kicking the shit out of you.'" After 8 months in Winston-Salem, Johnson was dying for a dose of the old glitz, and he arranged to get a double shot that March in Palm Springs. For the Reynolds executives and directors, their first Dinah Shore was a mind-blower. Attendees gained admission to events by flashing the $1,500 Gucci watch each was given. That year's Night with Dinah gala featured Frank Sinatra crooning, Bob Hope joking, and Don Meredith emceeing. "That's an awful leak you've got out there," cracked Meredith, referring to the fountain out front. "But don't worry, Ross'll throw enough money at it to fix it." Albert Butler, the Winston-Salem patrician, found himself paired with golf star Pat Bradley and baseball legend Johnny Bench, and prayed he wouldn't shank the ball in the crowd a la former President Gerald Ford, who was also playing. The Reynolds crowd had never seen anything like it. Over the years, the company had sponsored sporting events, but it leaned toward stock car racing. The week-long orgy of golf and glamour concluded with more gifts: Nabisco golf shoes and tennis shirts, Polaroid cameras, and compact disc players, all that each invitee's complimentary suitcase could carry. "We were all flabbergasted," recalled Butler. It was at the Dinah Shore that the strained relationship between Wilson and Stick finally fell apart when Stick was unable to land a seat on an RJR jet home. He blamed Wilson. Stick was still simmering 3 months later when, on a morning drive into his downtown Winston-Salem office, he noticed a new building going up near the Whitaker Park cigarette plant. "What's that?" Stick asked his driver, Eddie. "That's where they're going to work on that smokeless cigarette," Eddie said. "What?" Stick asked in amazement. Stick immediately confronted Wilson, who admitted the company had been secretly trying to develop a breakthrough product, a new high-tech, smokeless cigarette. Wilson said he had been planning to mention it to the board soon. Stick was aghast. That such a product could be developed without consulting the board was unthinkable. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Since 1981, said Wilson. 5 years. "Why didn't you come to the board with it sooner?" asked Stick. "Because it's had to go through years and years of testing to get to the point where we could even think about its being viable," Wilson replied. What Wilson didn't say was that he hadn't trusted the board to keep the project secret. Nor did he mention that he had funded its development by dribbling out appropriations in increments small enough to avoid having to obtain the board's approval. Project Spa, as it was codenamed, was indeed a revolutionary product. Later named Premier, the smokeless cigarette was Wilson's secret weapon to turn the tide on the anti-smoking movement, smite Marlboro, and reverse the tobacco industry's decline. Premier itself resembled a normal cigarette. Inside, though, it held only a smidgen of tobacco. A smoker lit a carbon tip on the end, heating, not burning, the tobacco and flavor beads inside. The process produced almost no smoke and no tar at all, only a fraction, in fact, of the compounds that had been linked to cancer. Wilson hoped it would keep smokers from quitting and draw ex-smokers back to Reynolds. Whatever its chances of success, the board was incensed that Wilson would attempt such a mammoth undertaking without its approval. He was summoned to explain himself at a July 1986 board meeting in New York. Wilson came fully armed, his tobacco executives giving a full presentation on Olive Premier's features. Wilson offered to let the directors smoke one. Albert Butler did, and didn't think it tasted or smelled very good. But it soon became apparent Wilson had bigger problems than foul-smelling cigarettes. "Why didn't you tell us about this sooner?" Juanita Krebs demanded. Wilson repeated the explanation he had given Stick, but Krebs didn't buy it. "You trust hundreds of company people working on this project. You trust dozens of people at an ad agency you're working with. You trust outside suppliers and scientists, but you don't trust us," she said. "I, for one, absolutely resent that." One by one, the other directors echoed Krebs's concerns and added more of their own. Stuart Watson of Heublein, for example, was steamed that Wilson was planning to sell Kentucky Fried Chicken. He didn't feel the board had been consulted on that either. "Don't you trust us?" Watson asked. "Don't you trust us?" A pair of Stick allies, Ron Grierson and John McAmer, chimed in from their perches on the audit committee. The $68 million Wilson had secretly authorized for Premier's development far exceeded his spending limit set by the board. Why, the two asked, hadn't it been brought to the audit committee? Soon, Stick jumped in personally to deliver his licks as well. The meeting droned on so long that New York police ordered the directors' limousines, which were lined up along Grand Army Plaza, to pull away. When the session finally ended, Project Spa had tentative approval to proceed. It had gone so far it hardly seemed worth canceling. And Tylee Wilson had used up what little political capital he retained with his board of directors. After a year of working elbow to elbow with Wilson, Johnson now struck like lightning. Out of the blue, he telephoned several directors and told them he planned to leave RJR Nabisco, possibly to head a British food company, Beecham plc. "No," Johnson told each board member, "don't try to stop me. There wasn't anything they could do." He felt his work was done after having successfully merged the two companies. Only one man could be chief executive, Johnson suggested coyly, and Wilson was clearly the board's choice. It was time to move on. "Not so fast," said one director, Charlie Hugel, just as Johnson knew he would. "Maybe you can run this place." Hugel invited Ross and Laurie Johnson to his New Hampshire summer place on Lake Winnipesaukee. The two men sat on the back porch nearly all night talking. They examined all Johnson's options. They analyzed each board member. They sipped drinks. They decided, at 4 a.m., that Johnson should take a run at Tylee Wilson. The following weekend, Hugel invited over Paul Stick, who had a nearby home. They too had a long heart-to-heart on the back porch. Hugel wasn't surprised to find Stick receptive. Johnson made a personal pilgrimage to follow up with Stick, flying to New Hampshire in a borrowed American Express jet to avoid alerting Wilson. "Well," said Stick when Johnson walked in, "we've wondered why it took you so long to get here." Soon, Stick enlisted McAmer, who thought Wilson's ouster a positively bully idea. He and Stick would pursue Johnson's case with other old-line board members. Hugel would work the Nabisco side of the aisle, though the likes of Andy Sage, Bob Shaberly, and Jim Welch hardly needed convincing. They were old Johnson partisans. Having planted the seed, Johnson laid back to watch. Stick and McAmer dutifully carried his case to the other directors. "We can't afford to lose Ross," McAmer said, pointing out that without Johnson, the company had only Ed Horrigan to fall back on in an emergency. "How could we ever fire Ty if we did that?" Then, in the first week of August, Johnson told Wilson he planned to resign. Wilson was alarmed, although for the wrong reasons. He, too, hated to lose Johnson. Thinking fast, Wilson noted a compensation committee meeting the following week, where he said he would be glad to discuss moving up his retirement date to the middle of 1988, the end of 1987 if necessary. Then, satisfied the matter would hold a week, Wilson flew to his Florida Keys home for a few days off. There, Wilson began receiving disquieting calls from allies in Winston-Salem. His enemies, he heard, were massing for an assault, which would install Johnson. Worried, Wilson called John Medlin, the chairman of Wachovia Bank, one of only 2 directors Wilson had put on the board. "Yes, something's going on," Medlin said. "I wish I could help, but you've got a problem." Wilson next called Hugel, who he knew was orchestrating the pro-Johnson movement. Should he call Stick? Wilson wondered. "He's not going to be any help," Hugel said cryptically. "McAmer? There's no point in it," Hugel said. He gave it to Wilson straight. "You don't have the votes." Wilson tried one last call to Vernon Jordan, but it was no use. "This one's lost," Jordan said. "You'd better cut yourself a deal and get out." Wilson saw the writing on the wall. At the following week's meeting, he resigned. To go quietly, Wilson received a princely pact, a lump sum payment of $3.25 million, continuation of his annual salary and bonus of $1.3 million until his official retirement at the end of 1987, and annual retirement pay totaling about $600,000 thereafter. The directors even threw in some perks: an office and secretary, a security system for his house, a car phone, and use of corporate apartments. Directors concocted a cover story for the public announcement. His departure, they announced, was in keeping with Wilson's long-standing desire for early retirement. Following the meeting, the full board made the change official in a conference call. After the slightest of efforts, Ross Johnson was named chief executive of RJR Nabisco, America's 19th largest industrial company. "Well," Tylee Wilson muttered afterward, "they got me." Chapter 3. Ross Johnson's rise to the helm of RJR Nabisco had proceeded with blinding speed. CEO of Nabisco in 1984, the Reynolds-Nabisco merger in 1985, CEO of RJR Nabisco in 1986. If he had stopped there, kicked back, and assumed the life of North Carolina gentry, history might have looked very differently on his career. But Johnson, a man who devoted his life to shaking things up, had no intention of changing his ways. Reynolds Tobacco churned out $1 billion a year in cash, enough to fund the wildest schemes and cover the worst mistakes. $1 billion, Johnson sometimes said reverentially. "You can't spend that much money in a year." But in sleepy Winston-Salem, Johnson was a Ferrari revving in a badly clogged parking lot. Under Wilson, he had kept a low profile and avoided stirring up the locals. After he took control of RJR Nabisco in the fall of 1986, Johnson's honeymoon proved short. One of his first moves was dealing with Ed Horrigan. Just days after Johnson took the top post, Horrigan walked into his office and offered to resign. After a year of internal sniping, he figured he would quit before Johnson fired him. Johnson shocked Horrigan by refusing to accept the resignation. "No," Johnson said, "I need you." Because Johnson still knew next to nothing about tobacco, he had to have a man who did, and, whatever their past disagreements, he was determined it would be Horrigan. Horrigan had raged about the luxurious New York apartments Johnson's Nabisco chums had. Johnson now made sure Horrigan got the most luxurious of all, in the museum tower above the Museum of Modern Art. Wilson had made Horrigan pay for his weekend excursions to Palm Springs. Not only would RJR Nabisco foot the bill for the trips, but Johnson gave Horrigan his own personal Gulfstream G3 jet, the top-of-the-line in corporate aircraft, to use as he wished. Johnson even encouraged Horrigan to lease a company car in Palm Springs, and Horrigan happily obliged, selecting a Rolls-Royce. Horrigan was given free rein to run Reynolds Tobacco and, to the shock of local gossip mongers, appeared to become fast friends with Johnson. Next, Johnson began to purge the ranks of the Reynolds Old Guard. Gwayne Gillespie was fired as chief financial officer and replaced by Ed Robinson of Nabisco. John Dowdle, the treasurer, accepted an early retirement package and was replaced by Nabisco's Mac Baines. Rodney Austin was fired as personnel chief and replaced by Andrew Barrett of Nabisco. Public Relations Chief Ron Sestana thought he was a survivor when Johnson told him he would move to New York to better oversee the entire company. But Horrigan despised Sestana, and when Johnson found out, he had Sestana fired. Mike Masterpool of Nabisco replaced him. All down the line, Reynolds people were thrown into the streets to make room for Johnson's Nabisco cronies. Johnson's troubles began when Winston-Salem began to notice the strange goings-on. Things the locals hadn't paid attention to when he was Wilson's number 2 were now held against him. No Reynolds executive in history had had a bodyguard, but at Old Town and Bermuda Run they whispered that Johnson hired one. He did. His name was Frank Mancini, a stocky ex-New York cop. The natives called him Lurch. Mancini was merely the vanguard of Johnson's effort to beef up Reynolds' security. Tylee Wilson was alarmed one day to see a man with a gun on his hip skulking around in front of his home. When Wilson demanded an explanation, the man said he was an off-duty policeman handling security in the area where Paul Stick also lived. "Well, I don't like you parked out in front of my house," said Wilson. "I'm not scared of anything." Those who knew of the incident were baffled. Winston-Salem just wasn't that tough a town. As Johnson consolidated his control, he shed his small-town poses and reverted to the Johnson of old. Most every weekend he jetted off to some far-flung golf club, tended to his tan in Florida, or hit Manhattan with Frank Gifford and other friends. Stick had begun the process, but under Johnson, RJR Nabisco was finally torn loose from the old-fashioned Reynolds value system. Out went Moravian, make way for Bacchanalian. Over the years, the unassuming largesse of Reynolds' senior executives had created institutions such as the Bowman Gray School of Medicine. Johnson's idea of good works was the Pro-Am golf tournament he organized to benefit the Wake Forest golf team. He brought in Dinah Shore and Don Meredith to kick off the local United Way drive. He went on the North Carolina Zoological Society's board and headed a fundraising campaign. But he raised eyebrows by descending on a function there in a helicopter. This in a town where Cadillacs were considered ostentatious. In a community of seersucker, Johnson pranced about with a puff handkerchief peeking jauntily from his jacket pocket. The capper was his wife. At Old Town, the matrons would draw close at the luncheon table. "Have you heard the latest?" They called her Cupcake. Laurie Johnson was a gorgeous blonde in her early 30s. The proper Reynolds wife wore conservative clothes and lots of makeup. Laurie bounced around in jogging suits, looking like the California girl she was. The proper Reynolds wife played bridge. Laurie was an ace golfer who could drive a ball as far as a man. She tried to fit in. She found some charities as pet causes and became a trustee at the North Carolina School of the Arts. When the International Advisory Board met in Winston-Salem, Laurie led a shopping expedition to the outlet malls in nearby Burlington. The corporate wives from around the world, including a Norwegian princess, came back laden with shopping bags. Trump Tower it wasn't, but if there was one thing Laurie Johnson was good at, it was shopping. It was hopeless, and the Johnsons didn't help matters any by flouting local mores. The gossips had a field day after Johnson took a top Wake Forest golfer under his wing and into his home. When the young golfer moved into the Johnsons' basement, rumors spread that he and Cupcake had been caught in the jacuzzi in flagrante. Every time Johnson left on a business trip, tongues wagged that Cupcake was sleeping with the Old Town golf pros. When the rumors got back to the Johnsons, Laurie called her New York friends in tears. A lot of them couldn't possibly understand the cruelties a small town could inflict. Jim Robinson's wife, Linda, did. The Robinsons and Johnsons had vacationed together in Roaring Gap, a good place to learn about Winston-Salem's establishment. "If we don't like someone in Winston-Salem, we make them sweat," one Roaring Gap matron was overheard to say. "We made the Johnsons sweat for everything." Tensions flared into the open that November when a Winston-Salem Journal editorial took frowning note of the company's name change and management upheaval, wondering just who had acquired whom. "Looks as if someone may have underestimated the Cookie Monster's appetite," it said. For Johnson, it was one of the last straws. "I don't have to take this shit," he said. Although he had done his best to disguise the fact, he hated small-town life. This wasn't what he had spent his career struggling to escape the Canadian provinces for. He loathed the petty politics that had sprung up since the merger. Corporate staff at the Glass Menagerie were constantly warring with the tobacco people downtown. Johnson quickly tired of moderating their disputes. But the worst part was simply living in Winston-Salem. "You keep running into the same people over and over," he told his New York friends. And few of the locals did Johnson relish seeing. He longed to light up a cigar with Jim Robinson, or Marty Davis, or Rand Ariskog of ITT, peers. Horrigan was good for a few laughs, at least he could hold his scotch, and there was John Medlin of Wachovia. But that was it. None of the merry men, city-bred Yankees and foreigners would move south. Their loyalty only went so far. You had a town of 140,000 people, where you've got 17,000 people working for the company and 10,000 retirees, and you can't breathe, Johnson recalled. To Johnson, there seemed only one conclusion: move. Relocating RJR Nabisco's headquarters would kill Winston-Salem, drive a dagger right through its proud provincial heart. Johnson knew it, and began laying his groundwork carefully. First, a cadre of close advisors began discreetly evaluating new sites. New York was an obvious candidate, although so far afield that it would inevitably jar the board, to whose feelings Johnson remained acutely tuned. Reynolds veterans would never move there, and some had to be retained, if only to avoid alarming the board. Dallas was Johnson's kind of town, bursting with new money and rootless people, and centrally located to Palm Beach and Vail, where Johnson maintained retreats. But he sensed it was a city in decline, what with the oil bust and the Dallas Cowboys beginning to lose football games. Atlanta also intrigued Johnson. Like Dallas, it was nouveau riche and rootless, and deliciously overbuilt. Top-of-the-line office space was going begging, ready for instant occupancy. It was near enough to Winston-Salem to be politically plausible. Then, while in London one evening that fall, Johnson ran into an old acquaintance, Don Keogh, the president of Coca-Cola, at a dinner given by Ambassador Charles Price for the Queen. As Keogh's wife shushed them to listen to Her Highness, Keogh heartily endorsed Atlanta. Atlanta it was. His site chosen, Johnson began working the board. "Corporate and tobacco are armpit to armpit in this town," he told Albert Butler. "It's not a healthy situation." Butler was won over. Johnson also won over John Medlin. Wachovia had just bought a major Atlanta bank and was trying to maintain a jury-rigged two-headquarters setup. Medlin well understood the pros and cons of each city. The biggest problem figured to be Stick. The Glass Menagerie was his pride and joy. It was Stick's secret hope, Johnson suspected, that the building would one day be named after him. Money could ease the pain. Johnson boosted Stick's consulting contract to $250,000 a year from $185,000. Prestige could do the rest. Johnson made Stick chairman of the International Advisory Board and promised to restore it to its pre-Wilson glory. A $6 million donation for the J. Paul Stick Center on Aging at the Bowman Gray School of Medicine helped. Stick soon came around. With the 3 local directors backing Johnson, the rest of the board's support seemed assured. But before the board could make the move official, the Atlanta Constitution broke the news, triggering the predictable firestorm in Winston-Salem. The Winston-Salem Journal implored the board to stay put, noting that local workers had built the company and local men had led it to greatness. The corporate soul and mind can flourish only where the heart, the roots, and the heritage are, said the front-page editorial. For the soul to survive, the head belongs with the heart. Overnight, Johnson became a local pariah. One man had brought Reynolds into Winston-Salem on a horse. Another would take it away on a Gulfstream jet. A country music station had a local hit with a ballad excoriating Johnson. Hobart Johnson, the factory worker cum major shareholder, marched into Johnson's office seeking an audience. The steaming mad octogenarian cooled his heels for half a day before heading home and composing an angry letter. "We built the foundation for this company," he wrote Johnson, "when you were in your knee pants." Johnson tried to defend himself in a speech to the Winston-Salem Rotary Club. But those who attended didn't so much remember the words as the aftermath. A phalanx of bodyguards surrounded Johnson and hustled him out on a freight elevator. One word that was remembered was bucolic, which was how Johnson described Winston-Salem in an interview with the Atlanta Constitution. Bumper stickers began appearing around town. "Honk if you're bucolic." Another had RJR on the left with a thumbs up, Nabisco on the right with a thumbs down. Savage new gossip about the Johnsons made the rounds. Rumors had Ross beaten up by local toughs. Cupcake had run off with a golf pro. Cupcake had run off with a tennis pro. Amid the turmoil, Johnson attempted to do something nice for his embattled wife. The wife of Johnson's friend Dwayne Andreas, the chairman of Archer Daniels Midland, was a trustee at a small Florida college named Berry University. Johnson arranged for the RJR Nabisco Foundation to make a fat donation to Berry for a new gymnasium. In return, the university would bestow Johnson with an honorary doctorate. When Johnson insisted his wife get one too, Berry agreed. Now the couple's critics took to calling Lori Dr. Cupcake. Hundreds of workers who wouldn't make the move to Atlanta would be fired. Reynolds veterans, who never before worried about losing the shelter of their fatherly employer, now lived in daily fear of finding pink slips on their desks. In some cases, entire departments were summoned for what amounted to mass executions. The tension was unbearable. "Shoot me between the eyes," a man in the tax department cried out one day, "but don't keep me in suspense like this." The Reynolds work ethic died hard. A group of 4 secretaries fired one afternoon stayed past midnight to complete a project. Gallows humor flourished. Bob Carbonell, Johnson's Latin American hatchet man, was said to have been recruited from a Salvadoran death squad. Photocopying machines worked overtime, producing underground cartoons. In one, Johnson was depicted climbing the miniature Empire State Building a la King Kong. In another, he was depicted as a missing child. The caption, "Happiness is when you wake up and see Ross's picture on the milk carton." Among the most bitter was one showing a rat, identified as F. Ross Johnson, feverishly humping another rat, labeled RJR Tobacco, as it lay helplessly pinned in a trap. The trap was labeled Bucolic Traps, Inc. The bait was an Oreo. A group of other rats ran eagerly out of a boardroom to watch. "Hey, Ross," asked one, "what does the F mean?" Johnson, a man with almost no roots, couldn't fathom the emotions he had unleashed. "Jesus Christ," he said, "Exxon takes 7,000 jobs out of New York and nobody bats an eyelash. I move a few hundred jobs out of there and I'm Attila the Hun." His reaction said a lot about Johnson, a man who felt AIDS didn't have a job but an assignment, who felt the moment he established an organization it started to decay, that standing still was a sucker's play. Why, he wondered, couldn't Winston-Salem see the plotter's day was past? The world was changing. You had to keep moving, or you were passed by. "Ross is addicted to action, to a constant dynamism," said O.C. Adams, a Connecticut psychologist who consulted with Johnson on personnel matters. "He can't always see what effect that has on others." The backlash made no difference. The meetings with Winston-Salem's mayor and North Carolina's governor did nothing to change Johnson's mind. Even before the move was officially announced, he and Lori had picked out a new $1 million home in Atlanta. The only sign of real trouble came when Stick changed his mind about the move. Few in Winston-Salem knew how Johnson had come to replace Wilson, but most suspected it had somehow been orchestrated by Stick. When news of the Atlanta move broke, Stick was suddenly called to account and forced to field tough questions about the man he had supposedly chosen to run Reynolds. Stick had voted in favor of the move, but under mounting pressure walked into Johnson's office with Albert Butler and tried to stop it. Johnson held his ground, but the incident gave him pause to reconsider Stick's power, especially among his fellow board members. He had seen what Stick and his allies had done to Wilson and was determined to avoid the same fate. No, Johnson told himself, Stick had to be made an ally. After all the grants and raises he had lavished on Stick, Johnson decided to do something more. He would name him chairman of RJR Nabisco. It would be a largely ceremonial position. Johnson would retain real power as president and chief executive, but the move would thrill Stick. "Don't do it. He'll only cause you trouble," Ed Horrigan said. "Don't do it. You don't need him," Charlie Hugel said. "You're kidding me," said Wilson when Johnson replaced him with Stick. "It's your company, so you do whatever the hell you like. But it's a sham, and you'll regret it." Weeks later, Stick was named chairman, and Wilson was right. Johnson came to regret it. When the move to Atlanta was officially announced in mid-January 1987, Johnson put the best face on it. Only the corporate headquarters was moving. Some of the 1,000 staffers would be offered jobs in Atlanta. Some would be transferred to tobacco. The 12,000-plus people at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco would stay put, and only a few hundred jobs in Winston-Salem would be lost. That, in fact, was how it worked out. Johnson made one final gesture to soothe Winston-Salem's pain, donating the glass menagerie to Wake Forest. Atlanta awaited, its throngs of boosterish businessmen thrilled to welcome a major Fortune 500 company to their ranks. But if the city thought it was getting a warm corporate benefactor eager to put down roots, it soon discovered the truth about restless Ross Johnson. Johnson took over 11 floors in an unremarkable glass tower at a suburban shopping center named the Galleria. In his maiden public speech, he suggested that his skeletal headquarters staff should not be reckoned as a dispenser of corporate largesse. "I told them I can't support every organization from the United Way to the Seven Jolly Girls Athletic Club beanbag competition," Johnson later said to an interviewer. "If it pisses them off, I can't help that." It was hardly the attitude city fathers had hoped for. "Don't worry, Winston-Salem," said the Atlanta Constitution headline the following day. "RJR move here was no great loss." Just weeks after moving to Atlanta, Johnson again shocked RJR Nabisco partisans. At a meeting of securities analysts, he mentioned almost in passing that he was thinking of transforming Reynolds Tobacco from a corporation into a limited partnership. In Winston-Salem, shareholders panicked. What was a limited partnership, and how would it affect their beloved stock? Inside the company, people rolled their eyes. No one could tell whether it was a certainty or just another half-baked idea sprung from Johnson's unpredictable mind. The announcement, in fact, signaled a change in Johnson's corporate focus. As takeovers swept corporate America during the 1980s, Wall Street investment bankers had long salivated at Reynolds's massive cash flow. It begged to be put to use in acquisitions. But they had never gotten to first base with Wilson, who relied for financial advice on solid conservative Dillon Reed. When Merrill Lynch bankers suggested looking at an LBO, Wilson's chief financial officer, Gwayne Gillespie, sent them packing. But Johnson was another matter. Here was a man the Wall Streeters could talk deals with. Big deals, exotic deals. The companies Johnson ran were in a state of constant flux, buying, selling, and reshaping their parts in tried-and-true pesketeer fashion. His door had always been open to discuss possibilities, whether the caller was Tylee Wilson, Bob Shaberly, or a Wall Streeter with a briefcase full of ideas. The move to Atlanta brought investment bankers streaming south like June bugs to a light on a hot Georgian night. To Horrigan, The growing tide of Wall Street callers resembled a steady stream of salesmen calling on the boss. It was because Ross was so open to it. It just got his juices flowing. Sometimes it got to be a bit much. Of the 40 or so phone messages Johnson accumulated on an average day, more than half would be from investment bankers. Johnson had always had his share of harebrained schemes, but now friends joked that Johnson and the bankers formed an Idea of the Week club. His Monday night wrecking crew long since broken up, Johnson enjoyed bullshitting with the bankers. He regarded their constant flow of ideas as free advice. Why have a dog and bark for yourself? He would ask. The limited partnership idea had come from one of Johnson's most determined pursuers, a wild-eyed Wall Street deal-maker named Jeffrey Beck. Beck worked for Drexel Burnham Lambert, the sharp-elbowed investment house whose Beverly Hills-based junk bond chief, Michael Milken, almost single-handedly transformed the takeover business in the mid-1980s. On Wall Street, they called Beck Mad Dog. Although he sported a bow tie and horn-rimmed glasses, Beck more closely resembled a cross between a stand-up comedian and an assassin. A true character, Beck styled himself the ultimate wheeler-dealer, a rock'em-sock'em behind-the-scenes operator, one of Wall Street's top 7 deal-makers. He could name the other 6, a bit of hubris not terribly far from the truth. "Rock and roll," he would shout to greet good news. "Lock and load," before entering a tense meeting. Beck served as informal advisor on the movie Wall Street, and even took a cameo role, delivering an angry, improvised speech as an investment banker readying his troops for a hostile takeover. While other bankers specialized in analysis or combat tactics, Beck made a career out of fast-talking and histrionics. When one of his biggest deals, the LBO of a Chicago food company named Esmark, was topped by another bidder, Beck pleaded with Esmark's chairman, Donald Kelly, to pay him for setting events in motion. "You gotta do something for me. You gotta do something for me," Beck moaned, lying spread-eagle on the floor of an Esmark office. Kelly, who intended to give Beck a fee, decided to play a joke on him by pretending to ignore his pleas. "He'll go crazy," Kelly told an aide. "It'll be fun to watch." Beck was called into Kelly's office and given the bad news. Oh my God, you can't do this to me," moaned Mad Dog, who proceeded to open Kelly's office window. "That's it. I'm going to jump out the window. I'm going to kill myself." Kelly, breaking up in laughter, yelled, "Don't jump!" For his work and his dramatics, Beck received a $7.5 million fee. Beck courted Johnson with his usual intensity. When, shortly after their initial meeting, the Johnsons were vacationing in the south of France, Beck sent the couple a bottle of Roederer Cristal and flowers. "Have a good vacation," the card read, "from the Mad Dog." Johnson instantly took to Beck's frat house mien. At their second meeting, he brought along a box of milk-bone dog biscuits, a joke on Beck's nickname. Then, while discussing restructuring plans with the chief of America's 19th largest industrial company, the Mad Dog ate the whole box. In late 1986, Beck was peddling the notion of a master limited partnership for Reynolds Tobacco. Johnson had long been worried that RJR Nabisco's stock price was unfairly penalized because of the company's tobacco operations. He believed investors never factored in Nabisco, choosing only to focus on tobacco's bleak future. Beck's partnership idea, codenamed Project Alpha, was intended to combat that perception. Holders of common stock typically receive small cash dividends, but by replacing much of RJR Nabisco's stock with partnership units, a portion of Reynolds's extraordinary cash flow could flow directly to the unit holders, allowing them to wallow in huge payouts while avoiding the corporate tax on common stock. Beck's hope was that the sky-high trading values of the partnership units would rub off on RJR Nabisco's remaining common stock, making everyone richer. Johnson thought the idea was impossibly complicated, but went along when Beck offered to do the work for free. The Mad Dog knew his favor would be paid off in more business later. Johnson was an idea man, not a details man. As ideas like Beck's began to pile up, he handed them off to an informal group of advisors he took to calling his financial R&D department. Johnson looked to the group headed by his old friend Andy Sage to separate the wheat from the chaff and perhaps come up with a few financial tricks of its own. Sage, who had sat on Johnson-run boards since the Weigel coup, was the son of a Wall Street stock specialist. He had been kicked out of the elite prep school St. Paul's, and his higher education was a trade school. But Sage had a certain eclectic brilliance that enabled him to fly planes, master the piano, and rise to the top of Lehman Brothers. He became managing partner and then president. But it had been years since he was very active on the street and, at age 60, was considered practically a museum piece. He came across as an absent-minded professor, given to wearing rumpled old suits. But Sage was that rarest of Wall Streeters, less interested in selling business than tending to how they ran. Over the years, he had been active in the restructuring of International Harvester, an architect of the Alaska pipeline financing, and, as chairman of the American Motors Executive Committee, helped steer that company through the shoals. He was a peripatetic figure, shuttling between homes in New York, Jackson Hole, and Palm Beach, where he had kept the home he bought from Johnson years before. When Reynolds acquired Nabisco, Sage added Winston-Salem to the list of places he hung his hat. There he would borrow an office and spend hours going through balance sheets and income statements. To pore over Johnson's ideas, Sage hired a Washington-based consultant named Frank Benevento, whom Johnson took to calling Sir Francis. Benevento was an odd choice. At 39, he had limited Wall Street experience, 4 years at Lehman Brothers. He had been a Washington lawyer before that and an energy industry investor and executive since. Sage was a mentor to Benevento and an occasional investor in his ventures. The two talked for hours about what they called financial architecture. Johnson thought the pair was top-notch. When their work surfaced months later, his Wall Street friends would wonder why. Benevento lived to untangle financial knots, and at Sage's direction, he plunged into Drexel's Project Alpha with gusto. Limited partnerships had proven somewhat successful in the oil and gas industry, and in meetings with Johnson and Sage, Benevento would prattle on for hours about new ways to reshape their architecture. He reminded Johnson of a mad scientist. Still, Project Alpha ultimately died. Benevento wasn't convinced the idea would help the stock, and Johnson, always wary of bureaucracy, recoiled at the paperwork it would require. "Holy God," he said when they killed it. "We'd have to get another tower here full of people doing everybody's tax returns. It's $200 of labor to save $1 of material." 2 months after riling Winston-Salem and Wall Street by mentioning the limited partnership, Johnson announced he was no longer considering it. Beck was undaunted. He promptly came back to Johnson with reams of computer printouts and another idea. Why not split up the company, spinning off Reynolds to shareholders and allowing management to acquire Nabisco in a leveraged buyout? Johnson passed the idea to Sage, who came up with his own twist. It involved redeeming all of RJR Nabisco's stock for a package of cash and stock. Management could then acquire Nabisco in an LBO valued at around $6 billion. Sage liked the idea enough that he assigned it the codename Project Satime, Midas spelled backward. Benevento, too, got excited and passed his thoughts on to Johnson. Johnson yawned. In an executive suite noted for ideas of the week, Benevento's scribblings were yesterday's news by the time they crossed his desk. Johnson himself had a new plan. It involved constructing a third leg for RJR Nabisco in the media business, a fascination that dated back to his friendship with Gifford. The immediate object of his attention was ESPN, the all-sports cable television network of which RJR Nabisco already owned 20%. Johnson had become intrigued with the idea of buying the 80% of ESPN owned by Capital Cities ABC. Don Ohlmeyer was brought in to evaluate the company, and Johnson for once followed through, offering to buy out Cap Cities for $720 million. He was turned down flat. Benevento was also left flat. He had hoped Johnson would broach their LBO idea at a board meeting in Palm Springs in late March. But as Benevento sat by idle, Johnson focused instead on ESPN, never mentioning any of Financial R&D's schemes. Later, Johnson told Benevento to forget about LBOs for now. For all his free-spending ways, the fact was Johnson remained a prude about corporate debt, the core of any LBO. He remembered the back-breaking trips to GSW's bankers 20 years before and cringed. Banks didn't understand the need for golf tournaments and corporate jets. They cramped his style. No, he told Benevento, he'd take a pass on an LBO. Jeff Beck proved tenacious. He knew what made Johnson tick. At Drexel, one of Johnson's nicknames was Starfucker. Hearing RJR Nabisco might be interested in media properties, Beck arranged a dinner at a posh New York restaurant, La Côte Basque, for Johnson to meet the actor Michael Douglas, a friend of Beck's who was looking to start his own production company. Nothing came of it, although Johnson had a marvelous time, as always. His power consolidated, Johnson relaxed and began to enjoy himself. Freed from the constraints of Winston-Salem, RJR Nabisco was a blank canvas Johnson now set to painting. The order of the day was having fun, and for Johnson that meant two things: movement and perks. From his new office above the Galleria, Johnson played the role of master puppeteer, keeping the company and its officers in a constant state of reorganization. Some of the changes seemed like sheer mischief. Johnson would order that 2 business units change buildings, knowing that one would wind up bursting at the seams, while the other would be rattling around looking for ways to grow. The joke at Nabisco offices in New Jersey was that Johnson owned a piece of a company called Quirk Moving Systems, which did all the moving. In the blink of an eye, he would order reporting relationships inverted, with the subordinate becoming the boss. "If my boss calls," the joke went, "ask him for his name and number." While Johnson chuckled at the helm, his whipsawed junior executives found the constant shuffling no joking matter. A case in point was the July transfer of a Nabisco unit, Planters, Lifesavers, to Winston-Salem, where it reported to Horrigan. The official reason for the move was that the distribution system of nuts and candies coincided with that of cigarettes. They were all so-called front-of-the-store items, sold in racks near cash registers. The real reason seemed to have more to do with patting Horrigan's empire, soothing Winston-Salem's pain, and providing new jobs for out-of-work Reynolds employees. Planters' president, Martin Orlowski, protested the move so vehemently that he was replaced by a Horrigan favorite. Scores of other Planters executives left rather than move to Winston-Salem and work with the Reynolds death merchants. John Grinnis, Nabisco's up-and-coming 42-year-old president, also fought the move bitterly until Johnson cut him off. "Hey, Johnny," he said, "stop taking things so seriously. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong. So what? We'll find out." The exchange captured both the slapdash spirit of the day and Johnson's continued ignorance of the pain his whims were inflicting. But the Planters' move also demonstrated the hazards of Johnson's impetuous nature. Having donated the glass menagerie to Wake Forest, there was no office space in Winston-Salem in which to put the incoming workers. RJR Nabisco was forced to lease the building back from the college. For his part, Johnson stayed clear of Winston-Salem as much as possible. He remained a marked man in North Carolina. That summer, Reynolds announced an early retirement program in an effort to trim 2,800 more people from the payroll. As always, Johnson got the blame. A story, widely believed, made the rounds in Winston-Salem that Johnson had gotten into a fistfight with Jerry Long, the domestic tobacco chief. Long had been defending the interests of Reynolds' workers, the story went, and had given Johnson a fat lip. Both men denied it, explaining that the rumor began on a day Johnson cut himself shaving and Long arrived for work in a cast following minor surgery. But it was a tough story to kill, because everyone in Winston-Salem wanted so badly to believe it. Later, after Long was purged from Reynolds, he ran for the county commission. When he was elected, some political observers gave credit to the lingering story of the Johnson fistfight. When Johnson returned to play in a Reynolds-sponsored golf tournament, the Vantage Pro-Am, he took hell from the gallery. He invited some of the abuse, arriving at the course in a helicopter and tooling around in a golf cart with his name on it. "Go back to Atlanta, you bucolic bastard," someone shouted. Even Johnson's playing partner, Arnold Palmer, couldn't escape the invective. "Nice drive, Arnie," someone yelled. "Too bad you have to play with that son of a bitch." The pièce de résistance, though, came as Johnson was carefully lining up a putt. Suddenly, a voice bellowed from the gallery, "It breaks south, you bastard, toward Atlanta." His estrangement from Winston-Salem may have contributed to Johnson's continued pampering of Horrigan. Having buried their old enmities, the two were actually growing close, as were their wives. Betty Horrigan was Canadian, and she could keep up with Laurie Johnson on the fairways. Johnson continued to give Horrigan everything he wanted, and some things he didn't ask for, including exclusive use of a lavish new home the company had bought at the Loxahatchee Country Club outside Palm Beach. He even indulged Horrigan's fetish for limousines, and not just any limo. When traveling, Horrigan insisted on a white stretch. He grew apoplectic if it was anything else, or if a chauffeur wasn't on hand at all times. Horrigan even insisted one be on hand to drive the few hundred yards between the Atlanta headquarters and the Waverly Hotel. The 1980s had introduced limos to Winston-Salem, and, with Johnson's approval, Horrigan switched the Reynolds fleet from black Lincoln town cars to maroon Cadillacs, with matching uniforms for the drivers. Maroon was Horrigan's favorite color. Johnson would roar with laughter at Horrigan's peccadillos and his craving for perks, but he granted every one. "I didn't care about the $50,000 for a chauffeur," Johnson said years later. "I cared about the $1.2 billion tobacco cash flow." As Johnson was distracted by other matters, he came to depend more and more on Horrigan to run tobacco, still the largest source of RJR Nabisco's profits. "The only question is," Johnson would say, "is the screwing I'm getting worth the screwing I'm getting?" One evening, the Horrigans had the Johnsons over for dinner. Talk turned to the burgeoning LBO phenomenon. "Oh, hell, we'll never do a buyout," Johnson said. "Just think of all the people that would be affected. We can't do that. Do we want to have to fire thousands of people? Can we live with that? Besides," he added, "we have the best jobs in America." It was no lie. RJR executives lived like kings. The top 31 executives were paid a total of $14.2 million, or an average of $458,000. Some of them became legends at the Waverly for dispensing $100 tips to the shoeshine girl. Johnson's two maids were on the company payroll, and Johnson's lieutenants single-handedly perked up the upper end of Atlanta's housing market. No expense was spared in decorating the new headquarters, highlighted by the top-floor digs of the top executives. The reception area's backdrop was an 18th-century $100,000 lacquered Chinese screen, complemented by a $16,000 pair of powder blue Chinese vases from a slightly later dynasty. Visitors could settle into a set of French Empire mahogany chairs, $30,000, and ogle the two matching bibliothèque cabinets, $30,000, from the same period. In each was an English porcelain dessert service in a tobacco leaf pattern, $20,000. The visitor might be ushered in to see Bob Carbonell and pad across his camel-colored $50,000 Persian rug. Or, if the visitor was lucky enough to see Ross Johnson, they could jointly admire the $30,000 worth of blue and white 18th-century porcelain china scattered throughout his office. If the visitor was really lucky, he was an antique dealer in town to take more orders. RJR was the toast of dealers in London, Paris, and New York. Laurie Johnson personally supervised many purchases on European jaunts with her decorator. Despite the $50 million cost of moving the headquarters, multi-million-dollar decorating projects were also underway at the old tobacco headquarters and the new Washington office. "It was the only company I ever worked for without a budget," gasped one grateful vendor. It was, literally, the sweet life. A candy cart came around twice a day, dropping off bowls of bonbons at each floor's reception areas. Not Baby Ruth's, but fine French confections. The minimum perks for even lowly middle managers was one club membership and one company car, worth up to $28,000. For serious luxury cars, executives had to kick in some of their own money. The maximum, as nearly as anyone could tell, was Johnson's 24 club memberships and John Martin's $75,000 Mercedes. Sweet as the surroundings were, the new headquarters developed a clear caste system. About a third of the 400 people working there had moved from New Jersey. Many were Standard Brands veterans. Another third were Reynolds people from Winston-Salem. The remaining third, mostly secretaries and support staff, were new hires from Atlanta. The Reynolds veterans felt they shouldered much of the menial work. Some began calling themselves the mushroom farmers because they worked in the dark and just kept shoveling manure. An inescapable air of the transitory pervaded the new headquarters. Instead of the grand old tobacco building in Winston-Salem, or even the glass menagerie across the street from a cigarette factory, Johnson had moved RJR Nabisco into a spec office building in a mall hotel office park complex that overlooked a highway cloverleaf. Some of Johnson's lieutenants, Ed Robinson and Andy Hines, the controller, hadn't even bothered to sell their houses up north. Ward Miller, the corporate secretary, hadn't even moved to Atlanta. Everything about RJR Nabisco said, "We're just passing through." But it was at nearby Charlie Brown Airport, where corporate Atlanta housed its jets, that the air of new money and restlessness found its ultimate expression. There, Johnson ordered a new hangar built to house RJR Nabisco's growing fleet of corporate aircraft. Reynolds had a half-dozen jets, and Nabisco a couple of Falcon 50s and a Lear, tiny planes an executive like Johnson wouldn't be caught dead in. After the arrival of 2 new Gulfstreams, Johnson ordered a pair of top-of-the-line G4s at a cool $21 million apiece. For the hangar, Johnson gave aviation head Linda Galvin an unlimited budget and implicit instructions to exceed it. When it was finished, RJR Nabisco had the Taj Mahal of corporate hangars, dwarfing that of Coca-Cola's next door. The cost hadn't gone into the hangar itself, but into an adjacent 3-story building of tinted glass, surrounded by $250,000 in landscaping, complete with a Japanese garden. Inside, a visitor walked into a stunning 3-story atrium. The floors were Italian marble, the walls and doors lined in inlaid mahogany. More than $600,000 in new furniture was spread throughout, topped off by $100,000 in objets d'art, including an antique Chinese ceremonial robe spread in a glass case and a magnificent Chinese platter and urn. In one corner of the ornate bathroom stood a stuffed chair, as if one might grow fatigued walking from one end to the other. Among the building's other features, a walk-in wine cooler, a visiting pilot's room with television and stereo, and a flight planning room packed with state-of-the-art computers to track executives' whereabouts and their future transportation wishes. All this was necessary to keep track of RJR Nabisco's 36 corporate pilots and 10 planes, widely known as the RJR Air Force. The aviation staff presented the plans for all this to Johnson with some trepidation. He had said state-of-the-art, but this cost $12 million. He had wanted everything a corporate jet hangar could possibly have, but this came out to 20,000 square feet. Johnson looked over the drawings, heard out the architects, and made his recommendation. Add another 7,000 square feet. The RJR Air Force was a defining symbol for Johnson. It was all about restlessness and restiveness. It was also about dispensing favors. Frank Gifford got rides home from Monday night football games. Gifford and his talk show host bride, Kathy Lee, were whisked away to their honeymoon on an RJR Nabisco jet. Johnson was best man at the wedding. When Roone Arledge needed a lift from Los Angeles to San Francisco, an RJR jet was dispatched from Atlanta. Johnson's old buddy Martin Emmett, long gone from the company, racked up more miles on Johnson's jets one year than nearly anyone still employed. The jets were also a symbol of the increasingly fuzzy line between what constituted proper use of a corporate asset and what constituted abuse. Some thought the case of Johnson's German shepherd, Rocco, fell in the latter category. At the Dinah Shore that year, Rocco bid a security guard, setting off a flurry of concern in the Johnson household. Would he be seized by the authorities and quarantined, or worse? Rocco, it was decided, had to go on the lam. He was smuggled onto a corporate jet and secretly flown out of Palm Springs to Winston-Salem, one jump ahead of the law. Escorted by a senior vice president named Dennis Durden, Rocco was listed on the passenger manifold as G. Shepard. It wasn't the only Rocco adventure. The company would later pay an insurance claim for a bite inflicted on the Johnsons' gardener. The RJR Air Force was Johnson's ticket to the high life. Each weekend, the planes disgorged Don Meredith from Santa Fe, or Bobby Orr from Boston, or the Mulroneys from Canada. The jocks of Team Nabisco were frequent flyers on Air Johnson. The Pope took excellent care of them, paying more for occasional public appearances than for an average senior vice president. Meredith got $500,000 a year, Gifford $413,000, plus a New York office and apartment. Golfer Ben Crenshaw $400,000, and golfer Fuzzy Zeller $300,000. The king was Jack Nicklaus, who commanded $1 million a year. Johnson claimed his jocks yielded big benefits in wooing supermarket people, but the line between corporate and personal services was a blurry one at RJR Nabisco. LPGA pro Judy Dickinson gave Laurie Johnson golf lessons. Gifford emceed benefits for Johnson's favorite charities like the New York Boys Club. A pair of retired New York Giant fullbacks, Alex Webster and Tucker Fredrickson, maintained offices at the Team Nabisco office in Jupiter, Florida. Fredrickson ran an investment counseling business from his. For all the money Johnson doled out for Team Nabisco, some of the athletes weren't easily managed. Nicklaus was notoriously difficult. For one thing, he didn't like playing golf with Johnson's best customers, which was his highest and best use. And he considered himself above the task of working the room solo at some Nabisco function. Although he was making more money than anyone at RJR Nabisco except Johnson and Horrigan, the Golden Bear growled at doing more than a half dozen appearances a year.